needs compassion, a love that's never failing. Let mercy fall on me. And everyone needs forgiveness, the kindness of the Savior, the hope of nations. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. So take me as you find me, all my fears and failures. I'll fill my life again. I give my life to follow everything I believe in. Now I surrender. I surrender. Oh, Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Shine a light and let the whole world see. Singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Oh, Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Blessed be your name in the land that is plentiful, where streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place, though I walk through the wilderness. Blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, your glorious name. You give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious cry out for you, the living God. Your spirit's water to my soul. I've tasted and I've seen. Come once again to me. I will draw near to you. I will draw near to you. Better is one day. Better is one day. Better is one day than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day. Better is one day. Better is one day than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts. Better is one day in your house. Better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in source to its light. It conceals it to bring us the coolness of night. None can fathom, indescribable, uncontainable. You place the stars in the sky and you know them by name. You are amazing, God. All powerful, untamable, awestruck we fall to our knees as we humbly proclaim. You are amazing, God. Oh, indescribable, uncontainable. You place the stars in the sky and you know them by name. You are amazing, God. Incomparable, unchangeable. You see the depths of my heart and you love me the same. Oh, you are amazing, God. Oh, you are amazing, God. Would you please stand and continue to worship with us? Lord of all creation, of water, earth, and sky. The heavens are your tabernacle. Glory to the Lord on high. God of wonders beyond our galaxy. You are holy, holy. The universe declares your majesty. You are holy, holy. Lord of heaven and earth. Lord of heaven and earth. Early in the morning, I will celebrate the light. And when I stumble in the darkness, I will call your name by night. Oh, God of wonders beyond our galaxy, you are holy, holy. The universe declares your majesty. You are holy, holy. The universe declares your majesty. You are holy, holy. The Lord of heaven and earth. Lord of heaven and earth. Hallelujah to the Lord of heaven and earth. Hallelujah to the Lord of heaven and earth. Hallelujah to the Lord of heaven and earth. God of wonders beyond our galaxy, you are holy, holy. Oh, precious Lord to me. Father, holy, holy, oh Lord of heaven and earth. Lord of heaven and earth. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. Early in the morning, your song shall rise to thee. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity. Holy, 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 all the saints adore thee, casting down their golden crowns around the glassy sea. Cherubim and seraphim falling down before thee, which word and art and evermore shalt be. Holy, 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 though the darkness hide thee, though the eye of sinful man thy glory may not see. Only thou art holy, there is none beside thee, perfect in power and love and purity. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. All thy works shall praise thy name in earth and sky and sea. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity. God in three persons, blessed Trinity.
How many of you are thankful this morning? Good. Lots to be thankful for? Yeah. And sometimes even with that, I can look at my life and I can say, I'm thankful my children are healthy. We got some good news this week. I don't know if you guys knew, but I have two kids who are graduating from college this semester in May. So Grace and Scotty are graduating, but Grace got accepted to a physical therapy school, and so she'll be supposedly attending University of Mary up in North Dakota come the fall semester. So I'm happy for that. My mom and stepdad made it back from the Philippines. They originally had a cruise scheduled to come out of Singapore, which was canceled for you know why. And so they arrived back in California on Friday, and I talked with her yesterday. She seems to be doing okay, and so I praise God for that. I mean, I'm thankful for it, you know. I'm thankful for my wonderful wife, and nothing else needs to be said. I'm thankful for my my children, thankful for Justin, as he brings a lot of encouragement our way, and just some of the things that he's been doing of late, just been fantastic. And so saying all of that, you know, I'm not just here to try to toot my own horn or anything like that. I'm saying that I have a lot to be thankful for. But even having said all that, sometimes I get a little bit ungrateful, you know. I lack the gratitude that I think I should have all the time. You know, I think that maybe if things aren't going just exactly the way I think they should go, even though all of these other good things are happening, I can focus on the one thing that's not happening. Amen? You been there? Yeah, we're like that. I don't know. I think I wonder if it's just me, but you just confirmed that it's not, so I'm thankful for that. But you know, it's kind of like the whole idea of the garden, and God says you can eat of any fruit of any tree except for this one tree, and that's the one that you focus on, you know? It's like, I got to have that, and nothing else seems to matter. And so I think about that, and I'm thankful, you know? But I understand that there are some things that come around in life that God allows in our lives to help us to grow, right, in our relationship with Him, and particularly in this area of hope, right? We suffer and we have to persevere through lots of things. And Romans chapter 5 says that as we do that we grow in our hope. We learn to understand how good God is. We begin to understand how messed up we are. And so we can grow in hope. And as we grow in hope, hopefully we marvel at God for the hope that we have in Him, the hope that He's given us. So this morning, that's what we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to talk about marveling at God for the hope that we have in Him. We finished last week in Genesis chapter 19, and we're going to start or continue on today in Genesis chapter 20 and chapter 21. And I'm going to do something just a little bit different than what I normally do. I am going to start with my points, and then I'm going to read through the scriptures and let you know how I got there. And so I'm not going to read all through the 2 chapters and then go back and do the points in the interest of time, and I think you can follow along with me. We'll be okay that way. But the idea this morning is to marvel at God for the hope that we have in Him, understanding that God is faithful and able to accomplish all of His purposes, that there's not anything we can do to prevent Him from fulfilling His promises, and that in His plan there is provision of peace. And I think we enjoy that peace. So this morning, we're going to look at marveling at God for the hope we have in Him. Genesis chapter 20. So here's my first point here, and it should come up here in just a minute. Our repeated failures cannot prevent God from accomplishing His purposes. Our repeated failures cannot prevent God from accomplishing His purposes. Now you say, well, why are you going there, Pastor? Well, because we had just read a little bit earlier about Abraham and Sarah, and if you remember, they were on their way to Egypt because there was a famine, and when they were approaching there, they agreed that they were going to lie about Sarah. They were going to say that, she's Abraham's sister because Abraham is afraid of what kind of people are here, and they might kill him to take her as a wife because at 75 years old, she was drop dead gorgeous, okay? Like my wife. Not at 75, but now. Okay? I don't know. She gets to 75, I'll have to tell her that then, right? But here it is. So it's the same sort of thing. So as we come to chapter 20, we see it's like, what's the line? Deja vu all over again, right? Deja vu means it's all over again, right? But deja vu all over again is like it's repeating itself. And when we think about God, when we think about ourselves, a lot of times we don't give God the credit he deserves for being as faithful and as gracious as he truly is. And we don't marvel at him the way that we ought to until we kind of go through something and we realize, oh, by the way, he's really good. By the way, he's really powerful. By the way, what I thought he couldn't do, he can accomplish. And so when you think about Abraham and Sarah here in chapter 20, they're going down here, it says in chapter 20, starting in verse 1. From there, and this would have been where Abraham was. If you remember last week, we looked at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he had been looking down on that area from where he was. And it says from there in chapter 20, verse 1, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. Sandy, would you mind doing the slides for me? Then that way I can focus on this. Thank you. And so we see that he's beginning to journey on. We don't know what prompted the journey. We just know that he's leaving from where he was and he's going someplace else. We had heard about Shur earlier. If you remember, Hagar had been there earlier when she left and ran away from Sarah, and it was kind of on the way to Egypt. So it's somewhere in between that area is where they are. And he sojourned in Gerar. In verse 2, and Abraham said to Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. So it's the same thing happening again. He's in a different place. This person, Abimelech, if you remember last time, it was Pharaoh in Egypt. And Abimelech, the name Abimelech means my father is king. Okay, Abimelech. Okay, and so this is a person named Abimelech. It was probably a common name there. We know that if you look in the book of Judges, Gideon named his son Abimelech. Even though they wanted to make Gideon king, he said, no, I don't want to be king. But he names his son, my dad is king. What's up with that, right? Anyway, here it is. Abimelech here, there's this guy named Abimelech, and he's there. He's the king of Gerar. And so when Abraham said that Sarah was his sister, then Abimelech said, well, I'll take her into my harem or my group of women here, my wives. And it says, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. So he's journeying to this place, and as he's there, he lies again about Sarah being his sister. Now, don't you think, give me your honest opinion, don't you just say, what's up, Abraham? Don't you get it? Didn't you learn your lesson last time? Right? Isn't that the initial reaction? No. It is, right? You say, come on, I would do better than that, right? I would have learned. I wouldn't be in the same. Man, last time, remember when I lied? That guy took her in and almost messed up everything, right? Because she was going to be one of his wives. And here it is again. And so when I say that there, sometimes we think more highly of ourselves than we ought to. Have you ever been in a situation that you've been in before and did the exact same wrong thing again? Let it sink in. Some of you don't believe you've ever been there. I think about when I was in school, and it's always this last minute, oh, Lord, help me with this exam. Help me, Lord. I'll never do this again. I'll study for sure next time. I'll get started right after this exam, and I'll be ready for the next one. And sure enough, boom, you get through that first one. Oh, I got through it, and no need to get started right away. I mean, after all, there's going to be a long time between the next test, right? And we're like that. And we don't think of ourselves like that. We think of ourselves as much better than that because we try a lot harder. And I don't want you to think, I don't want you to lose hope in the fact that you're hopeless. I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that you're hopeless and lose hope in it all. But I want you to understand that, in spite of that, right? That our repeated failures cannot prevent God from accomplishing his purposes in our lives. That's not to say we just go out and throw ourselves in front of a truck and be presumptuous about the grace of God and his goodness or any of that sort of stuff. It is, though, about us recognizing that sometimes we think it's all over because I failed God in this one place or I made this mistake again. The thing about Jesus Christ is that we are always dependent upon him. He continues to intercede on our behalf, right? At the right hand of God the Father. And we need that. Constantly. He's there. And he continues to uphold us. So when we think about this, when we look at Abraham and Sarah, we say, what's going on here? What I get out of this is that our repeated failures cannot prevent God from accomplishing his purposes. Because as we go on, it says in verse 4, now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent man? Because in verse 3, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent man? Would God do that to an innocent man? Would God do that to a righteous person based on what we learned last week? Were you here last week? Remember, Abraham is pleading on behalf of Sodom, and he says for 50, for 45, for 40, for 30, for 20, for 10, for the 10 righteous. And what did the Lord say? For even 10 righteous I won't, right? Because Abraham's whole thing is you're the judge of all the world. You're not going to take out the righteous with the unrighteous. That wouldn't be right, and you're righteous. So my question to you once again, is it right for God to kill an innocent, will you kill an innocent people? No, thank you. Did he? Steve, boy, we were stuck on that one, and now we can move on. Verse 5, did he not say, this is Abimelech pleading to God, did he not himself say to me, she is my sister, and she herself said, he is my brother? In the integrity of my heart, in the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart. And it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. So when you think about God and our things, God, we pray this, right? In the Lord's Prayer, we say, and keep me from evil, right? And so the idea is that God does that. He watches over us in that way. The problem is we tend to want to just keep on running to it ourselves. That's where the problem is. But here, this guy's like, hey, I didn't do anything. I just was acting under the information, the data that I was able to get, the intel that I had. She was okay, and I could take her in. And God says, you tell me you're going to wipe me out. And God says, I know. I know that you have done this in integrity of your heart. It was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Verse 7, now then return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. Oh, this is what God tells Abimelech. So Abimelech rose early in the morning, verse 8, and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." Verse 10, and Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" And Abraham said, "I did it because I thought there's no fear of God at all in this place." That's what he thought before. "And they will kill me because of my wife." That's what he thought before. "Besides," here's the rationalization, "she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." So he knows better. As he learned from before, at least he should know better, was what we understand here. But he gives this same rationalization, and it says here, verse 13, "And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother.'" Verse 14, "Then Abimelech, he took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, 'Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you.' To Sarah he said, 'Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated.'" So as they settle up on this, Abimelech seems to be, following what God has said, and then he still is going to be nice to Abraham. He recognized that God had called him a prophet earlier, and he'll pray for you. And so Abimelech is doing this, giving them these gifts here, and he's doing it as well to protect the integrity of Sarah, that she's not been violated in any way in this, in being taken in with him. He never touched her, we understand in the scriptures, and he's giving all of this back to let people know that it's a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. Verse 17, "Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children, for the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife." So you see how it unfolds here, and we think about, once again, Abraham, you think, well, he should know better, and this is just like what happened before, and yet, same old thing. But God continues to go along with his program. He continues to carry out and fulfill his purposes. That's what we're seeing unfold in Genesis. And so we had seen earlier that there was Abraham and Sarah running ahead of God to try to fulfill God's plan for him. But God says, "I don't need any help with this. I got this, and I'm unfolding it here." And so he remains powerful enough. And it doesn't matter how much our repeated failures are there, God will accomplish his purposes. So we want to take that there, and we want to marvel at God, because we know that we have this hope in him, this certainty that he's able to do these things. He has the ability to accomplish his purposes, to fulfill the promises in our lives, and it not dependent on us. Okay, there's situations where you do have a situation where God says, "If you do this, then I will take care of you this way." But the promises that we have in God, a lot of those promises are unconditional. It comes to us being in Jesus Christ. We have every spiritual blessing in the heavenlies. I've mentioned that a number of times. And there's some promises that God has given to us that doesn't matter whether we are failures or not. Okay, some of those promises are, God has promised us that in our Christian walk of faith, that he is continuing to sanctify us and to conform us to the image of Jesus Christ. He's faithful in doing that. We might be reluctant, we might be as non-compliant as we possibly can be, but nevertheless, God continues to work through all of that and to bring about his purposes in us. We think about other promises. He promises that the Holy Spirit will bear fruit in our lives. It'll be fruit that will last, and this is for his glory. We're promised that Jesus is going to return again. We're promised of the hope of heaven, the certainty of it. And so those are things that God has promised us. Those are the promises that we live in, and we want to be reminded of that, because God is able to fulfill all his promises, and there's not any obstacle that can prevent him from fulfilling his promises. Now think about that. And we always want to say, oh, these promises are all about me and my goodness, but they're for his glory as well. And so God will be glorified, right? There's no way. It's kind of like water. It's wet. God, glory. The two go together, you know? You don't get one without the other, you know? And so there it is, God and his glory. And so he will fulfill his promises, which is the second point. Yeah, there you go. Okay, I jumped on you on that one. There you go. So there's no obstacle that can prevent God from fulfilling his promises. Why do we need to know that? Because sometimes we think, oh, I've messed up so bad that God can't do what he's going to do in the world. He will do it. Here we go. We're looking at the birth of Isaac now as we go into chapter 21. And it says here, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And we looked at that at the end in chapter 19, and we see that God had promised that already. Okay, and so this is what's going on here. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, who Sarah bore him. She called him Isaac, which is what God had told him to call this child. Why? Because Isaac means he laughs, right? And they laughed. Abraham laughed when he heard that God said he was going to do this, and Sarah laughed when God said he was going to do this. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old. God had commanded him to do that, part of chapter 17, that covenant there. And in verse 5, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah is 90 years old at this time. So Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse him? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. We talked about the miracle in this. This was not expected. This was miraculous. And God had promised it. And so there's not anything that's preventing God from accomplishing or fulfilling his promises, as he said. It doesn't matter that Sarah's 90 years old. It doesn't matter that Abraham's 100 years old. It doesn't matter that God made the promise 25 years before. He's fulfilling his promises. His timeline might not be the same as ours. And so we have to recognize that. You know, he's sovereign. He's all wise. We are not. And so in understanding that, or at least accepting that he's all wise and he knows more than we do, we can accept his time frame here. So here's what happens here. Sarah gives birth. They call him Isaac, and she's full of joy. You know, she said, everyone who hears will laugh over me. Do we laugh when we hear about Sarah? Sometimes when we think about it, 90 years old with a newborn, you better have some help, right? Because that little kid's going to run you ragged. Here it is. We continue on here. I would just tell you, one time I remember my uncle and we were watching my sister's kids. My uncle didn't have kids till he was much older. And there was this time we were watching my sister's kids, and they were just running all over the place. I just remember. And we were just like completely wiped out at one of these, family functions. And it was like, woof, and we had a good ratio, There were two of us, I think there were two kids at the time. But he was like, woof, what a knockout, I didn't know God was preparing me for something better, So here we go here. So you get this, Isaac's born, and now we get what's going on is Isaac grows, and the child grew, and he was weaned. So they say probably about 2 to 3 years old there. Is around this time. So Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. And this laughing was not an Isaac good laughing. This was a laughing like it's an intensive form of the same verb, which has to do with making a mockery of somebody. Okay? So he's teasing this little kid. He's making fun of him when you talk about laughing here. So Ishmael, this is the son of Hagar. His name is Ishmael. Ishmael means God hears, right? God hears. So she said to Abraham, this is Sarah now, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. So as Sarah's looking at this, she recognizes, okay, the promise that God had given Abraham particularly would be through Isaac. This would be this promised blessing that we talked about last week. It's going to come through Isaac and then subsequently to Jacob. And so as this is happening here, she recognizes here's this firstborn child of Abraham through his wife. So we look back there and see that Sarah gave him Hagar, the Egyptian wife called a slave woman in the scriptures here, but it's his wife. And he has this child, this firstborn Ishmael. And Ishmael's making fun of Isaac, who is the son of the promise. And so she's like, this is not going to happen. I think there's some commentators who look at that and say Sarah could foresee how this was always going to be a conflict going on. And so she thought to deal with it right then and there and say, out. We'll send Hagar out. We'll send this boy out. They're going to be somewhere else. And so she saw this happening. In verse 10, so she said to Abraham, cast out the slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Verse 11 says, and the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. Now, even though Abraham knows that this blessing is coming through Isaac, he still understands as a husband and as a father, he has a connection with this woman and this son. This is still his son. And so he's troubled by this. It says it's very displeasing. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. In verse 13, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So even though Abraham's troubled by this, it says here, God said to Abraham, and so he's got some specific instructions on how to deal with this. And so he's dealing with it like this. So it says on verse 14, Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So it seems like he's not really doing much for him. Give him some water and say out on your own, and maybe a little bit of bread, and go out on your own. You're released there. She's no longer a slave. She's going to be out on her own now, and she's got this son with her. And they're going to wander and she departed, and it says, wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So this is not a place, when you talk about wilderness, it's not like wilderness you talk about, it's like a jungle wilderness. It's like a desert wilderness. And so she doesn't have much with her as they go there. And it says, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes, and then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. So she's crying there. Here's this sad situation. And we think that Ishmael's got to be, at this time, he's probably about 17, 18, somewhere around there. And so he's a young man, a grown man in a lot of ways, but he's there, and he seems to be kind of very weak in this regard. He doesn't have any water, and he seems like he's going to die. And so she cries out to God, and she says, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. Verse 17. And then it says, and God heard the voice of the boy. It didn't say he heard Hagar's voice. He heard the voice of the boy. And there's not any indication in the scriptures that he prayed, but he must have prayed Ishmael. What does Ishmael mean? God hears. So here it is. They don't name him Ishmael here, but here it is. The boy his name means God hears. And so God always hears what's going on with him. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. This is what God had promised before. And so he's still holding to this promise. It doesn't change things because God had made this promise to Abraham that his son, this particular son as well, Ishmael, would be a great nation. Didn't say that he would be the same greatness or anything, but would be a great nation. And so he reiterates the promise there, and God is faithful to his promise. He continues to fulfill his promise. It doesn't matter if people treat you bad, like in the case of Hagar. It doesn't matter if she's treated bad, right? God continues to fulfill his promise. And so we see this being, taking place in the life of Abraham and Sarah. We see it taking place in the life of Hagar as well, and Ishmael. And so when you think about, like I said, these promises that God has for us, he's faithful to fulfill them. There's not anything that will prevent him from doing that. So as we move on here, it says, verse 19, then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. So dealt with the immediate circumstances, and then we have some follow through on that. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with the bow. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So we get some beginnings there. We don't talk a lot about Ishmael later on, okay? This is it here. Maybe you'll hear some of the descendants of Ishmael later on, but this is pretty much it. And so here on verse 22, it says, at that time, Abimelech, you remember him from chapter 20? He's the guy that, Abraham prayed for and that he gave gifts to Abraham. And then after Abraham prayed for him, he was healed up because his, everything was barren there at that time because he was going to take Sarah as his wife. But he realized that God spoke to him in the night and said, you're going to die if you do this. And he tells him, I didn't do anything. I'm just acting under the information I have. And so God understood that. And God told him that he prevented him from sinning. So verse 22, at that time Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. They could see the blessing of God in his life. This is just something for us to think about. When we think about our witness and around the people that we're with, can they see the blessing of God in our lives? I'm not just talking about whether we're prospering or successful in our businesses or in our finances, but do they see the blessing of God in our lives? Do they see the gratefulness for what we have in God? Do they see the hope, the peace that we have when things are all out of control, it seems like? I think that's interesting or a question for us to ask because you think about it, they could see it in Abraham's life. God is with you in all that you do. Now, therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. So here's this Abimelech who wants to make a treaty here with Abraham. It says, we're going to have this ongoing thing, not just for me, you, but for our posterity as well, because I know that God is with you. I know that God has blessed you. It's obvious there. And I want us to be able to get along. And Abraham said, I will swear. When Abraham reproved Abimelech, now you get onto this and you see, okay, so he wants to do this. Abraham wants to make a treaty or is willing to make this treaty with Abimelech. Abraham's maybe questioning where this guy is coming from and wondering if he's really sincere in what he wants to do. Not just because they said they're going to make this treaty, because sometimes people say things and they do something else. But it's like this. It says, when Abraham reproved Abimelech in verse 25 about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. Here's Abimelech again. He's a man of integrity. And it says here that after they made this treaty, then Abraham goes back to him and says, hey, there's this well of water, and it was my well, and your guys came in and took it. And it seemed like this was maybe a common occurrence there. We get this a little bit later on in Genesis chapter 26, where Isaac is going around and he's digging some wells or undigging some wells that were clogged up that Abraham had built before. And there's people that says, those are my wells, and he keeps moving. right? Till he goes to a place where there's space, and he calls it Rehoboth, which means there's space, there's room there. So here, there's this situation here that arises. And so Abraham, he tells this to Abimelech, and Abimelech said, I don't know who's done this thing. I don't know which of my men have done this. I didn't know about it. This is the first time even hearing about it. And so Abraham, once he realized that, he took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? And he said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. So there's some sort of connection that's being made here. There's a gift that's given as a memorial, if you will, a memory to say that this is what's happening here. And so Abraham's all in on this. He recognizes that Abimelech is a man of integrity, and he's going to do what's right. And so he does this. And in verse 31, it says, therefore, that place was called Beersheba. And then you have a little footnote in your Bible that says Beersheba means well of 7 or well of the oath, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. So as Abraham is here and he's recognizing God's faithfulness in his life, he's also understanding that God, in his plan, provides peace. So in God's plan, there is a provision of peace. So if you think about it, as you look at verse 33, after Abraham makes this connection, these other guys go back to the land of the Philistines, and Abraham now is able to sojourn, to live in the land under peaceful circumstances. And there's this tree that's planted there, that he plants there as a memorial. And there's some of the commentators point out that the idea of the tree being there, being planted in a place that is like wilderness and near a well, shows that the promise or the trust in God to continue to provide so that the tree will grow. It will continue to be that marker of this covenant that's been made. And at the time it says that Abraham called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. So you have this picture of peace being provided by Abraham as God is fulfilling the promise there. And so it's just ongoing. So when I say these things and we look at Abraham's life, we think about our lives, and you think about the promises that God has fulfilled or the blessings that we enjoy from the hand of God in our lives. And, we can look back and we can look at all the hard things that we've gone through, the difficulties we've had to endure, the losses that maybe we've suffered. But having said all of that, do we still see God continuing to be faithful in our lives? Are we looking to that? Are we marveling at God for that? On a good day, when the sun is shining, right, we do that. Even that song, Blessed be the name, how's it go? Blessed be your name, right? When the sun's shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be, right? You have those moments when you feel that. You're in right connection with God, the relationship's going good, you're getting along with your spouse, your kids are prospering, they're thriving, and whatever they're doing, things are going well. You have those times. And so we can sing that when the conditions are right. But do we marvel at God in that as well? And I think that's what he wants from us. I think he never wants to stop just kind of filling our minds with the sense of awe and wonder about who he is, because he's awesome and wonderful. Amen? So let's marvel at God for the hope that we have in him. There's nothing that's going to prevent him from fulfilling his promises. That he is faithful to provide for us the peace in our lives. He's promised that. I mean, that is the first thing Jesus gave to his disciples, peace, right? And then as we think about it, even our failures can't prevent him from accomplishing his purposes. Because once again, he's wonderful, he's awesome, he's God.